I'm Frederick Riley. I'm the Executive Director of Weave, the Social Fabric Project at the Aspen Institute. I'm zooming in today from Washington, D.C., and I had a really good phone conversation this morning with my niece who calls me Uncle Poo Poo. I can't get into that story, but that really made me smile today. Weave was created in 2018 to answer the crisis of trust. This trust, social trust, when low, begins to whittle away at our democracy, our economy, increases crime, and seems to affect our way of life. Right now, trust in our country is at an all-time low. But I'm optimistic and hopeful because there are an army of people that we call weavers around the country in communities helping to restore healthy connections, bridge relationships, and increase trust. Our work at Weave is simple. It's to support those weavers with funding, tools, and resources, helping to amplify their stories and inspiring a new generation to weave. Today, we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, a term that you often hear at work, but we believe it's core to building trust and connected communities. DEI is used to describe representation and participation of different groups of people, including people of different ages, races, ethnicities, abilities, disabilities, genders, religions, culture, sexual orientation. I mean, that sounds like a community to me. And being said, we need everybody from across the land to be involved in the conversation if we're going to solve some of our biggest issues. So today we're going to explore how this social lens applies to our community work. I've said earlier, we hear about this often when we talk about work in offices, but we don't talk about it in the neighborhoods that we live in. And so today we're going to hear some stories about helping people see each other fully in our communities and how that can lead to deeper relationships and positive change and increased trust. Today, I'm talking to the dream team of panelists. I have Dr. Arvenita Cherry from Maximus. I have Pabon from Chicago Cares, and a really good friend to Weave, LB Prevette from Wilkesboro, North Carolina. So first question to all the panelists, Dr. Cherry, if you'll tell me a little bit about your work, something that made you smile today, and what brought you here to the panel today. Maybe that was 3 questions. I think you're on mute, Dr. Cherry.
I'm always on mute. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Arvenita Cherry. I lead the diversity, equity, and inclusion work at Maximus. I live in Oxon Hill, Maryland, which is in Prince George's County, Maryland. And let's see, something that made me smile today. I put in the chat, when I woke up, I smiled because I woke up with less aches and pains this morning that I'm normally waking up with. But actually thinking about the conversation we're having today and planning for that made me smile because there's so much energy around this topic and so much important work that's happening. So that made me smile. Perfect.
Rob, what about you? Tell us what brought you here today and something that made you smile today.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my name is Rob Pabon, he, him pronouns. I am with Chicago Cares. I'm also an alderman in my own community. And I think this conversation is so important. So I just want to thank everybody for creating space for this and for inviting me here. I think something that has made me smile today, I drop off my kids every morning. It is a mission. But I saw my little guy, my first grader, hanging out with his friends today, and it made me happy to see that he's been building relationships on his own and building friendships in this new school year. So really excited about that.
Wow. LB, last but not least, same questions to you.
Yeah, hi all, I'm LB Prevette. I just really love my hometown here in the foothills of Appalachia, where I serve as an advocate and storyteller, really focusing on the intersection of rural and queer identities. And something that made me smile today, you know, we first had the Weave team from Aspen come to my hometown 4 years ago, and we actually had a staff member this morning back in Anchor Coffee chatting. So it's just really warmed my heart to have this organization still like here in this town here in Appalachia.
Oh, wow. Well, we're excited to be there and can't wait for the learnings that we glean from our friends in Wilkesboro. Dr. Cherry, I'm going to start with you, right? The first question is, could you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion? And we hear it all the time. What's the problem DEI is seeking to address? And why is it so important?
Wow. Well, I, have the privilege of leading our work at Maximus and working with many people who support DE&I initiatives. We have amazing leadership that supports these initiatives at Maximus. One of the challenges, I think, is having common language about what it is, and that diversity actually means everyone. sometimes folks hear diversity and they think, oh, this just means women or people of color, when in fact it's all of us. And so I think before really getting into the other challenges, one is just having some knowledge and common language about what it is and why it's important to all of us, and how we're all expected to participate in supporting DE&I efforts, and how really it's good for all of us. Even targeted approaches that might benefit one group, it actually benefits everyone, and it benefits our organization. So I think an educational component to DE&I is important, and that helps us really address the other challenges that we seek to address.
Wow. So I hear you. I'm just going to push a little deeper. So what type of problems do we solve when you have when you include everybody?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the challenges when you don't have a diverse environment is you lose different perspectives. The innovation and all the possibilities that come when you have multiple voices with multiple experiences and backgrounds and perspectives, you miss that when you don't have it. Yeah. And so particularly in a business setting, that's what you want. You want innovation. You want multiple people working together, strategizing, and you want people to have the ability to come to work as their authentic self, knowing that, hey, when I walk in a room, I'm not going to be the only person here like me, and that someone like me or anyone is welcome. And, along with diversity, of course, are equitable policies and practices to address things that perhaps in the past, based on institutional and structural barriers, that can address those things. But also you want an environment of inclusion, because when people feel good about the space they're in, they show up, they do more than what's expected, and the product is that much better. So, again, I think the challenges are, being able to even have a DE&I lens when you're in any space, whether it's work or communities, asking, well, who's not in the room? Yeah. How do we get folks in the room? How do we get more chairs at the table? And thinking about what's limiting me from thinking in this way. Wow. So those are challenges, but they're also opportunities, I think.
Yeah. That's perfect. Thank you, Dr. Cherry. Rob, same question to you, but how does that fit in the lens of a neighborhood, right? So you're doing work right now to make sure equity and inclusion shows up in your neighborhood. What does that look like, and why is it beneficial to have that in the neighborhood?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I appreciate that. I think when it comes to community building and community organizing, equity really is doing the work of centering folks who either have not been at the table or who've been historically left out of the table, but really does the work to center the margins. And I think what we've seen is bringing an equity framework to community building has really allowed us to build those connections across difference with folks and allow folks an opportunity to be in solidarity with one another around issues that deeply impact each other. And so it's been a work around mutual aid and collective care. It's been work around supporting different issues that impact neighbors on a neighbor to neighbor basis, but also it's been a shift. And I just wanted to lift this up today because I read a book recently that talked about city planning and how it used to be that you would plan for the biggest group, right? Thinking that would actually make the most impact. But what we're trying to explain to folks and help them understand is that when you plan for everyone, when you make sure no one's left out, it actually increases the quality of life of that community tenfold, because you are doing the work of making sure you're not making folks invisible. You're bringing people to the work. And when you talked about democracy and the threat of democracy, when it comes to folks not trusting or having those connections, when people are apathetic and not involved in community work for years and years and years, that does erode the possibilities. And so we're seeing folks get more engaged because they're actually appreciated and centered. And they bring amazing ideas to the table that maybe folks have not thought of before.
Wow. Thank you for that, Rob. LB, I'm going to pivot to you, and your work looks a little different, right? You moved back to a town where you didn't feel included, and you came back to change that for people who live in your community. So talk about I told you about my camera that was having a bit by light, but we'll keep going with it. Tell us about what does that mean for you and the work that you're doing? And why is it so important for you to show up like that in your rural North Carolina town?
Yeah, absolutely. It's you know, growing up in a hometown as an openly queer woman, when I did, it was very much a like I was too queer for my town. You know,
Yeah.
I needed to go find our community. You know, our big queer community is not coming out of the cities to save us. We got to move out of rural America and into a city. And what I learned when I was in that environment was I was also too country for them. It was a different type of diverse when I showed there, like it was two countries. So I felt this liminal space of never belonging into either world. And I wanted to go back home. You know, I wanted to go back and find a way, because I felt like I was writing off my community and assuming they didn't accept me. I wasn't being vulnerable enough to truly come back and own it and show up and explain the hurt and harm and give them a chance to repair it with me and do better moving forward. And I think when we talk about, especially in the rural queer community, inclusion, that specific moniker that makes you diverse also will disconnect you from your family, from your church community, from like any structures you have. And so if we don't find a way to create a haven for ourselves, like there is nowhere to catch us, you know, when we are cut loose from those ties.
Wow. Wow. So tell me how you do that work in Wilkesboro. That would be helpful for folks to hear. Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, so I approach it first and foremost. So I'm an accidental weaver, just kind of stumbled into weave years ago. I did the work by coming home and living. Like I wanted to be myself fully and authentically and walk down the street and do community work and keep being myself as authentically as I could. And modeling the type of adults I wish I'd been able to see growing up, to know I wasn't alone and I wasn't different, you know, and something to be judged. Over time, now it's become where, you know, we work with St. Paul's Episcopal Church, you know, prior to COVID and figuring out things post-COVID, to do LGBTQ youth hangout, where we just gather our queer youth together with adults from that community to just share an experience and know that they're not alone, that there's a way that you can be both. If you love these mountains and this culture that's so unique to our area, you can embrace that into all of yourself and still stay in this community.
Wow. Thank you, LB. Dr. Cherry, I'm going to pivot back to you, right? So if you work at a place that doesn't center diversity, equity, and inclusion, you may have to change some things to get started doing this work. So what should organizations, communities, or people do if they're trying to center diversity and equity and inclusion in their work?
That's a really important question. I think one of the things we kind of lead with is this idea of having authentic relationships across difference. And so making that commitment to being comfortable with being uncomfortable at sometimes, that commitment to ongoing learning, especially when that entails a different experience or perspective than your own or one that you're comfortable with. Fortunately, you know, I'm in an environment where lots of that was happening before I came. I've been in places and situations where that was not the case. And I think that we have to be really intentional and really focused if we want to get improved outcomes for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I always say, lead with how can I increase my learning and not expect folks to do the learning for me? How can I really make a commitment to developing, you know, relationships, partnerships, things that go beyond work, but things that are going to really make a difference outside of, yes, I had lunch with this person this one time over the last 3 years, something that's really authentic. Yeah. And that signals that I'm here to do this work in an authentic and intentional way.
Wow. Rob, so you are working with Chicago Cares, you're an alderman. So what challenges have you had to overcome as it relates to kind of making sure you're centering diversity, equity, and inclusion in your community work?
That's a great question. I think one of the difficulties is that, you know, at Chicago Cares and even in my work in my community, you know, we always say that, you know, all things happen within relationship. That's the key piece to either creating change or building that trust. And throughout the pandemic, it was difficult for folks to get connected just in general. But further than that, over time, there has been that disconnect, whether it's polarizing political beliefs or just folks feeling disconnected or isolated from one another. And I think what we had to do so that folks can start building that empathy for one another is creating space. for folks to build relationship, like whether it's within service, whether it's within a volunteer project, or in community, and really calling people into that work and making sure that folks felt welcome in that space, regardless of how they approach the work. And so we've been doing that through listening sessions, community meetings, but really going to the doors and having those conversations and listening to folks where they're at, and talking about the ways in which that they can make an impact about the things they care about, has been a powerful, I guess, strategy, to break down some of those barriers. And it really just starts with that opening, allowing them to see that, the things that they care about are important, and that there's other people involved and that would like to work with them, to build that larger sense of community and belonging in their neighborhood.
Wow. LB, so I'm gonna ask you a practical question, because I grew up in a small town in Michigan, a city that's not really diverse. And sometimes I feel like I go home, I have to hide parts of myself to go back home. And so how did you approach, like, hey, we're gonna be a city that's inclusive, or a town that's inclusive? How did you approach that? Were there steps that you took? What are the steps you took, and what were some of the challenges you faced doing that?
Yeah, I think like saying that we're a city that's inclusive.
Yeah.
We're working on it. We're a community within
Yeah.
the city that is, getting like a lot of the powers that be to lean in.
Yeah.
But how good this has been for us is still a struggle. It's still a battle there. A lot of the lean in was just like having the conversation regularly and knowing I was going to get my feelings hurt a lot. And I had to approach that from a curiosity. Like, I need to understand where we took our first step off the same path. Like, growing up in a rural farming community, I have the deep belief that every single one of my neighbors loves every single one of their neighbors and what's best for them and wants to show up and take care of them. What my role is to figure out where we took that first step off the same path and how do we get back there to aligning with seeing your neighbor as your neighbor above all else and any other moniker we may put on them. So it's a lot of conversations, a lot of learning to feel an emotional reaction and choose a positive behavior, which has been a process, certainly, over the past decade and a half at home.
Do you have a specific story you might want to share about that, how listening to someone helped to kind of move them along the process? Because I have a ton of them, more with families, and I don't want to get into that because that opens up a whole thing, but I would love to, and I know the folks would love to hear how they can make that a little more practical.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think about it, it's different for me, I think, showing up when I talk about queer stories, because that's mine, right? I don't own this. This is a personal narrative. But the way I think of trying to show up for communities I don't represent becomes the, like, how do we practice allies? Like, how do you practice this art? And I had a gentleman in the wake of George Floyd's murder and our civil uprising wanting to rant to me, and he's telling a story. He's older, he was here through integration, about a Black man he'd went to high school with. And he's like, this guy got a scholarship at college, then he kept going, he got his doctorate. If I'd had that scholarship, and this whole, I've been listening to a lot of conversation around his opinion of BLM, trying to gently nudge him towards what I see as more holistic views. And when we got to the end, he's explaining this man's story, and I was like, okay, like, I hear you. Would you trade with him? He's like, what do you mean? I was like, would you have lived the life he lived through high school with you, through growing up in Wilkes County with you? Like, would you trade with him in exchange for a college scholarship? And if the answer is no, we have more listening to do at why that upset you. Because it's not even enough to make up for what he had to live through. But it took for us to get to his personal narrative, listening to his big political headline, like, emotionally charged statements, till we could get to this one personal narrative that's been guiding that statement and try to help reframe it.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that, LB. Thank you. Dr. Cherry, so how do you take diversity, equity, and inclusion work, or the idea of it or the practice of it, from work to our communities where we live?
Oh, wow. That's a really important question. I think that what we do at work is a lot of education and socializing the idea of DE&I. So we have community conversations, we have these First Friday networking events, we have a cultural heritage recognition program where we're highlighting different cultures and backgrounds every month. What I do is I take some of this home with me to my kids, to my family, to my friends. And so some of the same events or similar events, some of the similar conversations that we're having at work regarding culture and heritage and equity and diversity. I'm trying to actively have those in my communities, in my neighborhood, with my kids, with my extended family members. I live in the DC metro area, and so there are museums or cultural events all the time, and I'm really trying to be intentional about going to things and increasing my learning, especially if it's not part of my background or experience, and extending that to people I'm close with. I fully believe that is one way to bring us to closer understanding, to develop more empathy, and to be able to also take what we're doing in communities back to work and having that lens of engagement. Rob, I don't know, I'm thinking about some of the things that you shared with the work that you're doing. How do you feel about just this mere engagement across difference in communities, and how not only does it help the community, but you end up taking it back to work? Are you seeing that with some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's thank you for asking that question. I feel like the work that I do in community aligns so much with what's happening at Chicago Cares as well. It works together. It's very much building off of each other. And I think that I love that we're talking about DE&I in community. I think it's a very important conversation to have, but I also think it's important to lift up that equity work has been happening in communities for years, right? Organizing and activists and advocacy work has been around. And so when you bring in these other elements of weaving and bridging, and connecting folks across lines of difference, I think it does add another layer to it. But we have been seeing the impact of this type of I guess this framework in our communities for quite some time now. And I think I definitely feel like it's really important that, especially for organizations, when I think of like our work at Chicago Cares, that we did what you're talking about internally first before we can transform how we presented volunteerism to the public, and how we change the way people engage. And so that self-work is so important, not only for individuals, but for institutions as well.
Rob, I'm going to push another question to you, right? So I lived in Chicago for about 5.5 years, and Chicago is a city that is segregated, right? So if you're Black, you live on one side of town. Hispanics, you live on one side of town. So how do you counter the narrative when people say you don't need DEI work in communities in Chicago because everybody lives with people who look like them?
No, I think that's really interesting that you pose it that way. I feel like for us, we feel like equity and inclusion is so critical because of segregation, because of the history of systemic racism and housing and redlining, that there is work being done to break down barriers, right? We're a world city, yet we live in little pockets all throughout the city. And are disconnected from one another's stories, lived experiences, frameworks, lenses. And so to break those down, Chicago Cares uses service. Like we use service as a way to bring folks together across these lines of difference, whether it's through different communities or it's from the public sector to the private sector. We use that as a way to build those relationships with folks. But I think one model that we have used is something called neighborhood exchanges. And so bringing folks from different neighborhoods together to have conversations about the assets within their own neighborhoods, lift up the commonalities and the shared vision they have for their community success, and then reflect back what they learned about their neighbors, about folks that live maybe 15 minutes away, but they've never visited that side of town. And I think it's really powerful for folks to understand, wow, they have some of the same challenges, some of the same goals, but beautiful assets that they're bringing that are different than ours, and we can learn so much from one another. And I think that's the lifelong work that we as Chicagoans are dedicated to because of our history around something as harmful and impactful as segregation and redlining.
Yeah, it's a weird thing to live in a city. I tell people I was going somewhere on a different side of town. They say, "Why you live in the South Loop? Why would you be going there?" And I was like, "This is the same city." But Chicago's a city where you do everything in your neighborhood. So, LB. So sometimes conversations or bridging or bringing something new to a place that it's folks may see as weird is a hard thing to do. I mean, it gets people really uncomfortable. I remember coming out to my parents and the hurdle or the steps that it had to take for us to get back to what I consider to be a really normal relationship. And so how do you bring people on the journey to like, this is okay?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's really hard to bring them on the journey. I think first off, how many people don't ever get to start the journey because they don't have a support system?
Yeah.
Or that they can't risk the type of exclusion this is going to create for them to even tell their truth. So how do we get more people willing to start the journey, right? Is one of the first rules, like give them a system to come to. And that helps have the journey, right? You're not alone. There's other people to come to. The chosen family is, such an important part, I think, of queer community. The way that we choose like who becomes our family moving forward, because there is such a rate of exclusion when you live that authentically. From the community perspective, it's really hard, as someone who growing up and having, particularly violent episodes in my hometown and choosing to leave, coming back was hard and it was scary, but like, I just could not, couldn't separate. I remember coming back after my father had passed and, I'd had a bad queer experience, but in that moment, they just saw me as Chris's daughter who needed care and love. And I just refused to believe that they couldn't always see me that way and see everything about me. And I just think they deserve a chance. I think too often rural communities are written off as unsavable. If you're smart and different, leave. And then we wonder why they don't get any better. If we talk about DEI is rooted in empathy, but we take away the ability to hear a different narrative because we tell them to leave these areas. So we have to stay and challenge the narrative so that people from my hometown have the opportunity to be exposed to something different and learn empathy and practice that skill.
That really resonates with me. And in a lot of ways, I'm always rethinking or a little, sometimes I beat myself up about I feel like I get to help communities, but I've never done anything to help the community I grew up in, but it's because of the fear of not being accepted. So that resonates with me a lot, and I appreciate that. Same question for everybody, and whoever wants to jump in. What's an aha moment that you've had as you've been doing work with diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I'll actually jump in and something that we just talked about a minute ago about the importance of historical context.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm having this aha moment over and over again that, so many people don't have that historical frame. And so when we talk about solving for challenges, folks want to start today, and not go back last year or 10 years or 100 years. And so understanding the historical context of different policies and practices, understanding institutional and structural barriers, to understanding the history of a neighborhood. I kind of chuckled to myself that folks sometimes will default to, well, people live on this side of town with this group of folks because they want to, but there's a whole history behind, a Little Italy or a Chinatown or a predominantly Black part of town, et cetera, that folks don't know about because we at some point refuse to talk about history. And my aha moment is it's extremely empowering, it's important, and we can't solve for today's challenges or future issues without kind of going back in time, whether that time was last year or centuries ago. And that's kind of my aha moment. I would suggest to anyone leading in this work that you have to kind of do your homework and you have to lift that importance of history. And that's whether you're in a corporation or you're in a community, a neighborhood.
That's a true statement, and I won't go deeper on that, but that's an important first step. Rob, LB?
Yeah, I'd love to just jump in and talk a little bit about trust and consistency. I think that this was probably about 6-7 years ago. I was young, nonprofit professional. And I thought folks, should work together and collaborate no matter what, right? We're all pushing towards the same goals here, but understanding that folks have been harmed in the past, or folks do carry trauma, or folks do, maybe have some reservations or concerns, or maybe have been burned before, was something that I learned very early on, and how to help those folks heal is really important in this process. And showing up and being consistent as a leader or as an organization, to really allow them to understand, like, no, this isn't a temporary thing. This is something that we're calling you into, that we want you to be a part of, has been, I think, a really important lesson for me. In my own community, I worked on a little library initiative. It was a really fun initiative. But at first, nobody wanted to work on this project, and I had to like knock on doors, talk to people, reach out to different organizations, and let them know that this is something we wanted to do collectively, that we wanted all of us to be at the table to work on this project and center all of our residents when it came to literacy and biliteracy, but really for the purpose of building a sense of belonging for people that live in our community, that this was a symbol of that. And I think that was something that, I took from my early learnings, my aha moment around, you have to put in the work, you have to build the trust for folks to step up.
Wow. LB?
As someone who comes from a rural town that is 92% white, I can't echo enough what Dr. Cherry said at how much my mind has been blown at learning historical context. That was really just, I didn't understand, until I had access to that older. And it's, we can't, judge people for not knowing better. We got to help them know better. And then within my community specifically, I've been fortunate enough to have, a frequent person who brings up Rosamund Menachem about, you got to name what you're diversifying from, and so being in, I think about just on my planning board in my town, there's 11 members. The next youngest person is at least 2 decades older than me. She is the only other woman on the board and the only person of color on the board. We can't say we want more DEI work. What are we doing? Like, what are we diversifying from? We can't just say we want to be more diverse. We have to say, like, we have 9 straight white men in their 70s on this board. Like, you have to say what the problem is, or what it is that you're trying to change. Like, you can't just ignore it and use DEI as a buzzword without knowing what it is we're changing from.
Wow. So another question to the group. So you have folks on here who are from communities around the country and are interested in how they can dig in a little deeper or get started. Dr. Cherry, you started first with education, but what can people do to get started to make sure they're including everybody in the conversation in the work that they're doing in their community?
I think for me, and someone taught me this a long time ago, it's just having a little toolkit kind of in your head or in your back pocket. And so for me, I feel like I'm constantly thinking about, okay, who's not here? Who's not at the table? And what can we do about that? Also being reflective of my blind spots. I mean, I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I'm still a human and I still make mistakes and put my foot or both feet sometimes all the way in my mouth. And so, just being really reflective, being really thoughtful about, am I engaging others as I'm thinking about the work or as I'm going out in my own communities? Or when I see something, do I have the skill set to say something's not right, someone's not here, or maybe thinking about my own space of privilege as someone who, has plenty of spaces of not being privileged, just kind of acknowledging that I still have privilege and things still work to my benefit. So what am I missing? And who do I need to engage and how can I be more reflective? And that's something I find myself doing inside of work and outside of work. I'm not sure if this is actually answering your question, but I felt like when we get in tune with that and it becomes just a holistic, natural thing like breathing, where we're asking ourselves these questions, we can be better positioned to actually do something.
Perfect. You did answer the question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Rob, LB, Rob. Just jump in, whoever wants to.
You can go first, LB.
Cool. Thanks, Rob. As far as like, how do you get started trying to do it just as a neighbor? I think it's trying to practice hard conversations. Fortunately, my background professionally have been called contact center training. So I was really great at getting yelled at and listening non-defensively. But yeah, I think learning to listen non-defensively, like learning in a good faith conversation, when I feel my nervous system respond, how do I ask a question? Like, it is a skill. Some people may have a more natural level at it. It's a skill. You can work at it, you can hone it, and be like, I'm feeling riled up. I need to ask a question, because my neighbor surely did not mean it that way. Like, they surely don't mean that in their heart of hearts. Let me find out more. And so, yeah, I think just really practicing the non-defensive skills and then searching the hard conversations when you feel ready to have them. I think that is an important part of, don't go looking for conversations you may not be ready to have yet yourself. If you know you're going to be emotionally charged, be prepared for it.
Huh. LB, that's a really good point. And I think that I need to hone that in. Sometimes I feel like super uncomfortable, or my tentacles are up and I start sweating and I want to ask for clarity, but I go on and fester on it. And I think you're right. I should pose it then and not fester. So that's perfect. Thank you.
Frederick, may I ask LB a follow-up question?
Yes, of course.
So what is the advice you give to someone? Because I get this a lot, where folks say, I'm stuck in my silence. Like, I didn't know what to say. I knew this wasn't right. I wanted to respond, but I did nothing. Yeah. And we know sometimes silence, also indicates that you're kind of complicit in whatever the situation was. Sometimes folks are really kind of on the hot seat to speak up or to do something, or to walk out the room, or to indicate that I don't agree with this, or this isn't right. So how do you kind of balance someone who is frozen as they're trying to reflect versus just being responsive?
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good question, Dr. Cherry. I'm like, learning that non-defensive listening is an agreement is a really hard thing. And I think it also takes like a really clear sense of self. Like, I know where I stand. I know my community knows where I stand on issues, to where my silence is a condemnation, right? Like, it's because I have such a clear sense of who I am and knowing how I feel. But I think also what I've never went wrong asking the questions, because a lot of the things that feel like I should call it out, that feels like something so out of line and inappropriate, and I want to rage. When I ask that person questions about it, they make a fool of themselves at times. I don't have to condemn them. And that actually leads to self-learning. Like, they have their own moment of realizing they don't know why they think that. They can't go any deeper on that content. So it creates like the opportunity for self-learning, and kind of helps that, like, I didn't have to tell you were wrong. I'm just going to ask questions and see if you really can defend that opinion.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add to that like, tell me more, or say more, or what did you mean by that, are my favorite questions to ask at the door when I'm hearing maybe things that I feel might be problematic, or might be just aggressive around a specific issue area or a group of people, because I want to get to that understanding of where this is coming from. And I think it often helps people realize that they don't know where it comes from at some point, or they need to do some work around it. So yeah, this is great.
So I just want to remind the folks that are listening in that if there are particular questions you may have, you can place them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. But one of the first questions that popped up to anybody on the panel is about curiosity. And so how do you lean into curiosity as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think that one's tricky. I think that sometimes there is this privileging of, I need to know about you, or I have the right to ask you very personal questions. Versus I'm generally curious, I want to learn, I want to make a connection. And I think we have to, I think it goes back to, considering the microaggressions that people experience, and everybody's experienced them, but some people experience them more than others. So they're like mosquito bites. And so your question to that person, especially if you have no relationship with them, they don't know anything about your intent, what you're committed to, and you ask them something that's deeply personal, that perhaps all week long or their whole lives they've been asked this question or forced to answer a question, that might not go well.
Yeah.
And I think that I think it's important to also be curious and to form authentic relationships and get to a point where you know, show genuine care and concern. But I think you have to weigh a lot of different things before you make that move. And
Yeah.
what happens often is someone will make that move and then the outcome isn't good. It isn't positive. So then that person retreats and says, well, I'm not going to attempt to have any kind of relationship because the last time I asked someone that or was curious about this, you know, so it's a tricky question. I think there are different nuances there, different scenarios to play out, but I think it's always considering what the person you're curious about, what their experience every day to day might be. Especially if they don't know your intent, you haven't revealed your commitment to DE&I, and it comes across as you demanding to know something about them or their situation instead of a true curiosity. But I don't know, I'm kind of thinking out loud here.
No, that's a perfect response. But I do think it goes back to the earlier point you made about education and reading. And, you know, I've learned so much about people, the plight of people, the journey of, you know, I just read a book about the Great Migration from the South to the North. And there are things that I didn't even know that happened that I'm like, oh, wow. And so I think like this continuing learning journey would be an important part of the curiosity versus making somebody else your educator. You can educate yourself.
Yeah.
Rob, LB?
Yeah, I just want to add to that I think sometimes with that curiosity, what ends up being sort of harmful is like this sense of urgency around it. And so I tell people like, take time, like this is a journey for all of us, right, around this topic. And so if you're curious about learning more and you want to do better and all that good stuff, you don't need to solve it tomorrow. And I think that's where folks can kind of stumble and get into trouble and cause harm when they're trying to be well-intentioned. And just going back to what you all are saying, there's so many resources on the topics of diversity, equity, inclusion that folks can dive into. And, you know, the burden should not be on an individual or a group of people to teach folks that information. So rooting yourself in that and reminding yourself that this is going to take time. You're unlearning, maybe depending on how long you've lived, 30, 40, 20 years of, you know, this type of thinking. And so you need to take your time with it and take it and, you know, be really intentional about it.
Yeah, I think in that same, as far as like learning about issues that don't impact, you know, you directly and the identities you share, being curious is great. Finding people who are already providing that emotional labor outside of your personal community. Like I recurated my Instagram to be following like people who are willingly giving this like experience and information out to the world as a choice to educate myself outside of like, you know, asking folks, especially I think when I think about race issues in a county with a demographic like mine, it is really hard to try to do things or it's really easy to do things under the guise of DEI that become tokenism, right? Like it's not really inclusive. You're just looking to fill a leadership role. You're not creating a space where that whole community feels more present, right? So I think there's a really big, like speaking of there on curiosity towards what you may not identify with. I think where I find curiosity most powerful is with people who may be in a position of power and reluctant to create a more inclusive space. That's when I find curiosity most powerful, figuring out why. Because again, I just refuse to believe that's their core belief, that they don't want a more inclusive, better, more vibrant and whole community. I don't think there's anyone who doesn't want to be connected to all of their neighbors and all of their neighbors to feel welcomed and loved. So if someone's giving a message or doing actions that seem contrary to that, my job is to be curious at where are we missing the step?
Wow. So one of the questions that we received is to LB, but I'll turn the question to everybody. So the question is about non-defensive listening skills. Who is teaching these practices and skills? So LB, who's teaching that? But Dr. Cherry and Rob, like what's one book or one training that kind of changed your thinking that everybody can easily assess and start on this journey?
So like in my personal story, it really, I wasn't kidding. It came from being a contact center trainer.
Oh,
like,
wow. Yeah, wow.
And, you know, we train essential skills. How do you de-escalate angry customers when you have no power? Like you're in low power. What can you do to like get this person to understand and stop yelling at you about something that wasn't your fault, that you didn't create. It is an everyday skill that people in the customer service industry and our frontline workers practice because they're consistently put in positions of low power and having to listen non-defensively to someone that they know is wrong and they can't do anything about. And so I think really going to people who do that job every day, talk to your servers, I think you would be shocked if you went into a lot of contact center, even big realtors. And this is a opportunity for a lot of public-private partnership. Like, how do you train your frontline employees to de-escalate? That's non-defensive skills. Why are we not framing it? Sherry's point about bringing DEI home. When we're teaching these things in corporate environments, are we framing it as a community skill? Because I would, of like this thing of getting hooked and having a reaction, like probably at the time outside of what my employer would have wanted, but would say like, what in your community hooks you? Like, what are the things you hear about yourself, and kind of bring that conversation into the workplace. That was where I learned the skills and where the root of a lot of the theories I practice come from.
Wow. Dr. Cherry, Rob, Dr. Cherry, no particular order.
I'll jump in. LB, it's interesting. One of my first jobs was at a call center. And the level of customer service training I got was out of this world. It actually, initially I was going to say, I used to be a middle school teacher and I used to teach at an alternative school, and and that helped shape me. But as you were talking, I said it was my call center work of working with a range of folks, people who would yell and scream at you and all of this. It helped me as I moved into the classroom and, had I just mentioned I worked at alternative school. I kept reminding myself I'm a teacher. My job is to teach everyone, regardless if they're throwing stuff or having a fit or super quiet. And so that is a valuable skill set. I think that has, because of that experience, that has taken me pretty far. And I think someone in the chat earlier said something about just being quiet for a minute and just processing it and remembering why you're here, what the goal is, what your job is to do. So.
Yeah, I love that. I think where I get it from is I'm a trained peace circle keeper. And so nonviolence and restorative justice training is something that I went through early in my career in the nonprofit sector, especially working with youth. And being in those scenarios where folks were in deep conflict with one another, but being able to listen and use some of those strategies to work with individuals who are dealing with a lot of trauma. And I think that's one thing that I think it's really important to understand is when you get a door slammed in your face, or when a person does maybe say something that's harmful or hurtful, it's really not about you. It's sort of a projection of some of the pain and trauma they're experiencing in that moment. And so it's not to let that person off, that it still does hurt and it still is, it could be violent, but that it is, you're able to take yourself a little bit away from that and do that deep listening and pivot when you need to and reframe. And I would suggest, in Chicago in particular, INVC is a really amazing organization. The Institute for Nonviolence Chicago is a partner that we work with, and they give great trainings, virtual trainings on nonviolence strategies, and I can link that in the chat.
Perfect. So I know there's some questions that we weren't able to get to because our time is dwindling. But I do want to say to our panelists, this has been a really engaging conversation. I have been checking the number of participants, and typically with these things, they dip and they dip and they dip, but we've kept a consistent number of people here. So you all have done an amazing job with some really great information. But as we can, as one last word, and everybody jump in when they're ready or as they feel led. But the last question is, this word can sometimes, DEI can be a buzzword, and right, and it can be a thing that people check a box on. And so, people can begin to glaze over it. And so what's something that you've learned, or something you've learned the hard way, that helps to make DEI work real for people? Take about a minute. Okay. No, not a minute to think. Come on, Rob, jump in. You're ready for this.
Okay, let's go. Well, I would love to just share that, when our organization went through our transformation and started to, adopt our equity analysis and went through anti-racism trainings and really started changing our organization from within, and getting rid of some old institutional artifacts that we had, we did an equity analysis, and we discovered who we were centering in our work. And that was really shocking, to understand like who we're actually centering versus who our mission is supposed to be centering. And I think that experience helped me, like really humbled me, because I was a community organizer. I cared about my community. I worked in the nonprofit sector. I told myself I was doing great work. And here I was centering white corporate America, right, through the work that I was doing. And it was so humbling, but also so life-giving, because then I was able to turn around to other people and teach that and share that like we are all unlearning things all the time, and we're all growing and developing, and it's a process. And so I think one thing that can stump folks and can make it difficult to bridge and across difference is this idea that it has to be perfect all the time. And so we want to meet people where they're at. We want folks to be able to stumble from time to time, and we want them to continue on this journey. And so for folks to see maybe someone who is doing this work share that story, and be able to talk about how I was on my own journey, even especially as a person of color, I think helps people better understand that it isn't about perfect, it's about progress.
Oh, wow. Thanks, Rob. LB?
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, Rob. That was great. I think you have the spot on that it's not perfect, it's progress. It's not a box to check because it's never going to be done. Like we're always going to be learning more. And when we know more, we'll have to do better by it. Like again, the community I've raised me, there was a lot of things that I thought were just appropriate and normal terms that I've learned are not. And I'm still unlearning them every day as I, am exposed more and more to the world. I think for me, the kind of like big aha, and like I guess what now is seen as DEI work, was I was carrying around a lot of this hurt about my own exclusion from my community. And eventually it just got to be too big for me to believe it was intentional anymore, And so a lot of times I think I'm seen as, I know I'm a bright-eyed idealist, about things, but it's the only way I can like see, that's the only truth I could tell myself about my community. This is not harm we mean to put on each other. We just like don't get it yet. Like there is a path towards love and connection to fix it and understand each other and find a way better. Whereas like that was the big thing for me of like, if I lead with we have to be okay, like we are all good in agreement that people are loving and worth this, then we can figure out where we're getting off track.
Wow. My friend, Dr. Cherry, I'll give the last word to you before I wrap us up.
The pressure.
No pressure.
I was just thinking about at work, we launched company-wide unconscious bias training for our people managers, and we had a very high completion rate as a result of that activity. And I had a number of colleagues afterwards either say, I did well on this, I don't have any bias, and I'm like, well, that's not possible. We're all human. And I try to model like, I'm on this learning journey. We're going to be on it together, But I had a number of folks say, how do we continue? This was the first time I had an opportunity to be reflective about my own unconscious bias. This was the first time, and I've managed people, I've lived all over the world. I've never really had a dedicated conversation about unconscious bias and what that means for hiring and promotions, what that means for, certain policies. How can we go deeper on this? And I found that when you give or support people with tools and resources to learn, regardless of where folks are on this continuum, more often than not, people will rise to the occasion and say, I need more support, or I want to learn more about this, or can we pull some resources so we can go deeper with our entire team? Can we do this again next year? And so the more that we're able to support folks in having productive conversations, even if it's difficult, the more we can expose people and not assume, well, you're a certain age, or you live in this part of the country, or you have this many degrees, you've led this many people, and make assumptions that, well, you should get it. I think it proves valuable to have those resources available, and to have folks on the standby to have these kind of deeper conversations about how we can move to the next level, how we can move DE&I to the next level, which then moves our work, our company, our communities to another level. At least that's what I think. So
no, that's perfect. So before I thank you all for joining, there's a link in the chat for a 1-minute survey. I'm wondering if you all can click on it and take it now before we exit today. It will be really helpful for us. But I want to take a minute just to thank Dr. Cherry. I'd like to thank LB, and I'd like to thank Rob for spending this hour and giving their expertise to this really important topic. This notion of including everybody is not only important to our workspaces, but it's important to our communities. I think when I started this, I talked about the challenges that our country is facing right now. And I do wholeheartedly believe that I'm optimistic that we can fix and that we can trend up, but it's going to take including everybody in the conversation for what community is. And so I think as we begin to approach this work in our communities, let's suspend our notions of what a community is and what the table looks like and who sits around the table, and just be open to dreaming of a different community, a future where people are connected, where people care for each other, and where we see each other as human. Thank you to each and every one of you who joined us today. There are opportunities for you to continue to connect with us at weareweavers.org. You can join our online community and continue the conversation, or just sign up for our newsletter. It's been my honor to serve as your host today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Cherry. Thank you, LB. Thank you, Rob. The comments in the chat don't lie. Folks really enjoyed their time with us today, and I appreciate you for spending time with us. Have a great day.